For decades, the royal family has survived by mastering one discipline better than any other institution in the world: silence. Never complain, never explain. It is a strategy designed to outlast outrage, outpace speculation, and allow controversies to burn out on their own. But according to people familiar with recent private discussions inside Buckingham Palace, that strategy may have fractured from within. In the days following renewed circulation of controversial photographs online, sources close to the palace claim that Princess Anne addressed senior figures privately, not in a press briefing, not through aides, but in direct conversation. And what she reportedly confirmed changed the emotional temperature of everything that followed. The dossier exists, and warnings were raised. Those words, as described by individuals who say they were aware of the exchange, landed with extraordinary force. Because for years, Prince Harry has maintained that concerns raised by his family were exaggerated, reactive, or shaped by prejudice rather than evidence. If internal assessments truly predated public fallout, that narrative becomes far more complicated. According to people familiar with Harry's reaction, the confirmation was not received calmly. It was described as deeply upsetting, not because it created something new, but because it suggested something old had never gone away. That questions had been documented, not imagined, logged, not improvised. What makes this moment so significant is not the claim itself, but its timing. The alleged confirmation did not come during peak media chaos. It came quietly after years of silence, when many believed the file had been buried permanently. Royal insiders say the issue was never about public embarrassment. It was about internal risk, vetting processes that occur long before headlines, reviews meant to identify vulnerabilities before they become leverage. The question now circulating behind closed doors is not whether Prince Harry was wrong to trust his instincts. It is whether he was warned about concerns he chose not to hear. To understand why Princess Anne's reported confirmation carries such weight, it is necessary to rewind to the point where those concerns allegedly began. A moment when romance intersected with protocol and routine checks produced results no one expected. That moment, according to sources, came in the autumn of 2016. In late 2016, long before engagement rumors or public declarations, standard royal protocol quietly moved into place. Any serious relationship involving a senior royal triggers routine background reviews. These are not accusations, they are safeguards, designed to protect the individual and the institution from future pressure. According to people familiar with the process, most reviews end quickly and uneventfully. Names are cleared, files are closed, life moves on. This one, sources say, did not. What reportedly caught attention was not a single incident, but a contradiction that analysts struggled to reconcile. Public interviews and biographies from the period painted a consistent picture. A working actress, modest income, career uncertainty, a familiar story in Hollywood. At the same time, according to individuals who claim knowledge of the internal review, separate intelligence summaries painted a different picture. One involving repeated presence in elite international settings that typically require either extraordinary wealth or deliberate sponsorship. These were not casual events. The environments described in the summaries were invitation-only spaces, private gatherings, yacht-based social circuits, locations where access is tightly controlled and costs are rarely paid by guests themselves. In intelligence work, consistency matters. When lifestyle indicators do not align with declared means, questions follow naturally. Not because wrongdoing is assumed, but because unexplained access represents potential vulnerability. According to palace insiders, these discrepancies were escalated beyond routine staff review. Senior figures responsible for oversight were briefed. This is reportedly when Princess Anne became directly involved. Those who have worked with her describe someone deeply familiar with security briefings and unafraid of uncomfortable conclusions. She is said to have examined timelines, travel correlations, and contextual summaries rather than media narratives or public perception. The issue, as framed internally, was never about morality or personal choice. It was about exposure. When individuals move repeatedly through elite power spaces without visible financial backing, analysts ask who facilitated that access and why. Sources emphasize that none of this constituted proof of wrongdoing, but in security terms, unanswered questions are logged as risks. Risks are documented so they cannot be ignored later. According to people familiar with the review, a summary was prepared and shared with a limited circle. The intent was not to interfere, it was to inform, to ensure that decisions were made with awareness rather than assumption. This is where perspectives reportedly diverged. Some viewed the concerns as theoretical, Others, including Princess Anne, are said to have taken a more cautious view. Experience teaches that vulnerabilities often remain invisible until pressure reveals them. The disagreement remained private. It was never meant to leave internal files. What happened next, according to those close to the situation, transformed quiet caution into lasting fracture. And it began with a conversation neither side would later forget. According to people familiar with the situation, the conversation that followed was not ceremonial or scripted. It was private, direct, and unusually candid. Princess Anne, they say, chose to speak plainly rather than soften her message. Those who claim knowledge of the exchange describe her focus as singular, not personality, not emotion, risk. She reportedly explained that the material under review was not rumor or tabloid speculation. It was compiled through routine intelligence methods, travel correlations, financial context, photographic documentation circulating within restricted channels. None of it decisive on its own. Together, it raised questions that could not be dismissed. According to sources, Anne emphasized that unexplained access is treated seriously in any security assessment. When individuals appear repeatedly in elite environments without visible means to support that access, analysts ask who facilitated it and why. The concern, as framed, was not judgment, it was leverage. People familiar with the dossier say it outlined repeated exposure to circles known for cultivating relationships quietly and strategically. Access to private gatherings, invitation-only events, and social spaces where discretion is assumed and obligations are rarely written down. In intelligence terminology, this pattern is often described as strategic social placement. Anne is said to have explained that strategic social placement does not require malicious intent. It relies on proximity, opportunity, and expectation. Doors open, expenses are absorbed, familiarity grows. Over time, unspoken obligations can form. According to those present, she asked a question that cut through everything else: who paid for it? Analysts had reviewed available financial records. They reportedly did not show expenditures consistent with the level of travel and access depicted. That gap, sources say, was the core issue. When funding sources are unclear, vulnerability follows. Prince Harry's response, as described by people close to the exchange, was defensive. He reportedly interpreted the warning as an attack on someone he trusted. To him, the concern sounded like suspicion rather than protection. Sources say he rejected the premise outright. From his perspective, the dossier represented everything he believed was wrong with palace culture: distrust, control, a refusal to accept personal happiness at face value. He reportedly viewed the material not as caution but as insult. That moment, according to those familiar with the aftermath, marked a turning point. Princess Anne is said to have made her position clear. Her responsibility was to warn, not to decide. Once awareness was given, the choice belonged to him, but the record would reflect that the warning had been issued. The dossier was not meant to resurface. It was meant to remain archived, a precaution documented and set aside unless future events gave it relevance. For years, it did exactly that, until present tensions collided with questions that had never been fully answered. As time passed, the material documented in that early review did not disappear. According to people familiar with institutional records, it remained dormant, referenced only when new information intersected with old questions. That is how security files function. They wait. Sources say the reactivation did not happen all at once. It came through overlap, names recurring across unrelated contexts, photographs resurfacing years later, travel references aligning with timelines already on file. None of it decisive alone. Together, it suggested continuity. Individuals familiar with the renewed review say analysts focused on facilitators rather than personalities. In security work, networks matter more than individuals. Who introduces whom, who controls access, who moves comfortably across elite spaces without formal titles or visible wealth. Within that framework, attention reportedly returned to private membership ecosystems that operate internationally. These environments are not casual social clubs. They are curated networks where introductions carry weight and access is often sponsored. Presence in these spaces is rarely accidental. According to sources, analysts mapped repeated intersections between the same social environments, the same intermediaries, and the same outcomes. Appearances that seemed spontaneous publicly began to look structured when viewed across years rather than moments. What raised concern was not a single connection but repetition across cities, across events, across periods when public narratives emphasized struggle rather than access. Timing also mattered. Several of these intersections reportedly intensified shortly before the relationship with Prince Harry became public. Analysts flagged that convergence because timing often reveals preparation rather than coincidence. People familiar with Princess Anne's perspective say this is where her caution hardened. Experience teaches that patterns are rarely visible from inside a story. They become clear only when viewed from a distance. According to those close to her, she did not interpret the material as proof of intent. She interpreted it as unresolved exposure. Exposure becomes leverage under pressure, regardless of original circumstances. As public tensions escalated years later, these earlier patterns took on new relevance. Allegations of betrayal, manipulation, and narrative control reframed the original warnings in ways no one had anticipated. It was at this point, sources say, that Princess Anne felt compelled to clarify one thing internally. The concerns were not invented after the fact. They were documented before decisions were made. That clarification, though private, carried emotional weight. Because once that acknowledgement existed, the issue shifted from speculation to record. And record changes everything. When word of Princess Anne's internal clarification began circulating quietly among senior figures, the response followed a familiar pattern. Publicly, nothing changed. No statements were issued, no press lines were corrected. The palace maintained its practiced stillness. Privately, according to people familiar with the atmosphere, the mood shifted noticeably. What stood out most was what did not happen. There was no formal denial of the dossier's existence. No senior figure publicly stated that the concerns had never been raised. No attempt was made to dismiss the matter as fiction. That absence, observers note, was not accidental. When institutions believe a claim is entirely baseless, they tend to reject it quickly. Here, restraint prevailed. According to individuals close to Prince Harry, the confirmation landed as a personal blow. For years, he had framed family warnings as reactive, shaped by media pressure or internal bias. Learning that concerns were documented early, before public conflict, reportedly altered his understanding of past conversations. Sources describe his reaction as intense and deeply emotional, not because the issue was new, but because it suggested that trust had been strained long before he realized it. That realization reportedly deepened feelings of isolation rather than reconciliation. Within palace-adjacent circles, discussion reportedly became more guarded. Legal advisors revisited earlier decisions, not to assign blame but to assess exposure. Security professionals re-examined how vetting conclusions are archived and referenced. Once an internal concern is acknowledged, it cannot simply be forgotten. Outside the palace, commentators who became aware of the situation indirectly focused on the silence. Analysts noted that no effort had been made to reframe the concerns as routine or inconclusive. That choice, they argued, signaled caution rather than confidence. Public reaction, where visible, was divided. Some interpreted the silence as validation. Others viewed it as an attempt to avoid reigniting controversy. But most agreed on one point: the issue had moved beyond rumor. The existence of internal concern, even without public disclosure, shifted the frame of the entire story. It suggested that what appeared chaotic externally had been preceded by structured assessment internally. And that shift carried consequences far beyond headlines. Once the internal acknowledgement settled in, the consequences began unfolding quietly. According to people familiar with institutional decision-making, confirmation of prior warnings changes how every later choice is interpreted. Past decisions are re-examined, present positions harden, future risks are recalculated. For the palace, the implication was not about revisiting old arguments. It was about limiting exposure. When internal assessments are shown to have existed before public controversy, advisors become more cautious. Any public clarification risks inviting demands for evidence that cannot be responsibly released. This is why sources say silence became policy rather than avoidance. Intelligence reviews are not designed for public debate. They exist to inform judgment discreetly. Once acknowledged, even privately, they shape behavior long after headlines fade. For Prince Harry, the implications were more personal. According to people close to him, the realization that concerns predated public conflict reframed his understanding of family dynamics. What he once believed to be reactionary resistance now appeared, at least internally, as preventative caution. That reframing reportedly intensified frustration rather than easing it. It introduced the possibility that decisions he viewed as betrayal were driven by institutional fear of vulnerability. When personal trust collides with institutional logic, neither side feels fully understood. Observers also point to broader consequences for how the monarchy manages relationships moving forward. According to constitutional analysts, once internal warnings are acknowledged, precedent is set. Future relationships may face deeper scrutiny earlier. Documentation may replace discretion sooner. This evolution does not require public confirmation to be effective. Institutions adapt internally, protocols tighten, access narrows, risk tolerance declines. For those watching from the outside, the absence of visible fallout can be misleading. The most significant consequences often unfold behind closed doors, measured in altered procedures rather than dramatic announcements. What makes this moment particularly consequential is not what has been said publicly, but what has been accepted privately. Once an internal acknowledgement exists, it becomes part of the institutional memory that guides future choices. And that brings the story to a critical threshold. Not a conclusion, but a narrowing of possibilities. As things stand now, the situation remains deliberately unresolved. No official clarification has been issued about the nature of the alleged dossier, its scope, or its conclusions. No documents have been released. No timelines have been confirmed. According to people familiar with the matter, whatever exists remains confined to restricted institutional channels. That silence has created space for questions that refuse to settle. If concerns were identified during early vetting, what exactly was flagged at the time? Were the issues categorized as theoretical risk or as material exposure? And were those assessments ever updated as circumstances changed and public pressure increased? There is also the question of timing. Why did confirmation, even privately, emerge now? Institutions rarely reopen dormant files without cause. Something intersected with the past strongly enough to prompt internal acknowledgement. What that trigger was has not been disclosed. Observers have pointed to the emotional toll. According to people close to Prince Harry, the confirmation felt less like a warning and more like a judgment. It challenged the foundation of choices he has defended publicly for years. That kind of realization does not resolve easily. Another unresolved issue is the absence of denial. No attempt has been made to categorically state that the dossier never existed. No effort has been taken to frame the concerns as routine or inconclusive. Legal advisors, when approached indirectly, have reportedly declined to engage. In institutional terms, that restraint is notable. It suggests a calculation that speaking carries greater risk than remaining silent. Such calculations are usually made when documentation exists that cannot be easily simplified for public explanation. There is also the broader implication for the monarchy's internal trust. When private records diverge from public narratives, reconciliation becomes difficult. Silence may preserve stability, but it also preserves ambiguity. For now, uncertainty defines the landscape. The questions remain open, the file remains unclosed, and the silence, intentional or not, continues to shape interpretation. Which leads to the most difficult point of all. Not what happened, but what happens next. What remains now is not a verdict, but a shift in weight. When an institution built on discretion acknowledges something privately, it changes how every past choice is viewed. Motives are re-examined, silences take on meaning, and certainty becomes harder to maintain. For Princess Anne, according to those close to her, this was never about spectacle or vindication. It was about record, about ensuring that caution raised early is not erased later by convenience or conflict. In institutions that measure time in decades, memory matters more than momentary peace. For Prince Harry, the implications are heavier and more personal. If concerns existed before public fallout, then the story he has told himself becomes more complex. Not necessarily wrong, but incomplete. And incompleteness is difficult to accept when identity has been built around clarity. The palace, meanwhile, appears committed to containment. No amplification, no elaboration, just distance. Institutions rarely seek to win arguments. They seek to minimize exposure. That strategy frustrates observers, but it is consistent with how power protects itself. What remains unresolved is whether silence will continue to hold. Files have a way of resurfacing when conditions change. Internal. Acknowledgements can become external reckonings through time, pressure, or necessity. History often advances not through announcements, but through accumulation. Those watching closely understand this is not an ending. It is a pause, a recalibration, a moment where private records have quietly asserted themselves over public narratives. Because once a warning is confirmed, even behind closed doors, it cannot be undone. It can only be remembered. And in institutions that survive on memory, that may be the most powerful force of all.